Hey there, night wanderers. Welcome back to Night Story HQ, where the shadows speak louder than words, and the truth is often stranger than fiction. Tonight, we unseal a case that has haunted the alleys of Los Angeles for nearly a century. A tale wrapped in glamour and horror, innocence and brutality, beauty and grotesque violence. This isn't just a murder story. It's a mystery etched into the bones of Hollywood's golden age. So turn off the lights, lean in close, and let's journey together into one of America's darkest unsolved cases, the murder of Elizabeth Short. You may know her better by a name born from headlines and horror, the Black Dahlia. Our story begins not with her death, but with her life, because Elizabeth Short wasn't always a macabre legend. She was born on July 29, 1924, in the Boston suburb of Hyde Park. Her father, Cleo Short, built miniature golf courses. During the Great Depression, his business failed, and one day in 1930, Cleo simply vanished, his abandoned car found near a bridge. Everyone assumed he jumped to his death, but years later it turned out he was alive, starting a new life in California. That betrayal would quietly mark Elizabeth forever. As a teenager, she was delicate, plagued by chronic bronchitis and severe asthma. The damp New England climate didn't help, so her mother sent her to Florida during winters. Those who knew her then described her as dreamy, soft-spoken, and fascinated by films and fame. She had the look that 1940s Hollywood adored: dark, wavy hair, porcelain skin, wide eyes, framed with arched brows. There was something almost otherworldly about her. Even before the headlines, people said she looked like she belonged to a different world. When she turned 19, Elizabeth left Massachusetts for Santa Barbara, hoping to break into movies. But the reality was far less glamorous. She picked up waitressing jobs, moved constantly, and tried to make connections in the film industry. At times, she dated servicemen and hung out near military bases, gaining a reputation not always fair for seeking attentions and security. She wore tailored black outfits, stark red lipstick, and carried herself like a noir heroine. Somewhere along the way, people started calling her the Black Dahlia, inspired by the 1946 film noir, The Blue Dahlia, and her signature style. She told people she was a model, an actress, even that she had been in films, though none of it was true. Still, there was something about her that pulled people in. Maybe it was the contrast: vulnerability and ambition, warmth and mystery, light and shadow. By January 1947, Elizabeth had been in Los Angeles for only a few months. She was drifting, staying with friends, acquaintances, sometimes even strangers. On January 9th, she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel downtown. She had just returned from San Diego and was reportedly meeting someone. That night, she vanished. 6 days later, on the cold morning of January 15th, a woman named Betty Bersinger was pushing her baby stroller through Leimert Park, a quiet suburb south of downtown. As she walked along Norton Avenue, something caught her eye in the vacant lot ahead. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, a department store dummy. White, motionless, too symmetrical to be real. But as she got closer, the truth hit her like ice water. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a body, severed at the waist, drained of blood, the skin pale as snow. Elizabeth Short's remains were laid out in the grass with surgical precision. Her upper and lower halves were placed several inches apart. Her mouth was slashed from ear to ear, what's now known as the Glasgow smile. Her body had been scrubbed clean, hair styled, hands posed, and bizarrely she had been displayed. The killer wanted her found. No effort to bury, no attempt to hide. Police arrived quickly, and within hours, the press did too. In post-war Los Angeles, Crime sold newspapers, and this case had all the ingredients of a media frenzy: beauty, youth, mystery, and horror. Reporters quickly identified the body through fingerprints and military records. The Black Dahlia was dead, and her death was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The autopsy revealed even more disturbing details. There were signs of blunt force trauma to the head, ligature marks on the wrists, and cuts that were precise and methodical. The bisection of her body was clean, so clean that the coroner suggested it had to be done by someone with surgical training, possibly a doctor, or someone who wanted it to look like one. The media went wild. Headlines screamed Black Dahlia slain, tortured beauty queen, and fiend slayer still at large. Reporters hounded her mother, even calling to say Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, just to get her talking before revealing the truth. The LAPD launched a massive investigation. Hundreds of detectives were assigned to the case. More than 150 suspects were questioned in the first few weeks alone. Soldiers, ex-boyfriends, film industry types, and even a handful of doctors were interrogated. But the deeper they dug, the more tangled the story became. There were no witnesses, no murder scene, no blood found at the location her body was discovered, meaning she was killed elsewhere and transported there. The killer had completely cleaned her, removed evidence, and vanished without a trace. Then came the letters. A week after the murder, the Los Angeles Examiner received a chilling note, a ransom-style letter made from magazine clippings. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Included in the package were Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and even her address book, some pages torn out. The envelope was wiped clean, no prints, except for one partial fingerprint. But in a tragic twist, it was smudged in processing, lost forever. Other letters followed, taunting the police. One simply read, "I will give up in Dahlia killing. If I get 10 years, don't try to find me." Whether these were the killer or a sick prankster remains unknown, but they kept coming, and the fear in the city grew. The murder changed Los Angeles. The dream factory of the West was suddenly a stage for a nightmare. Parents locked their doors, girls stopped walking alone, and the press couldn't get enough. They published Elizabeth's personal letters, diary excerpts, and grainy photos. They painted her as everything from a seductress to a lost waif, sometimes both in the same article. And then, like smoke, the leads dried up. The LAPD received over 500 confessions in the years that followed, some detailed, some delusional, but none panned out. Some suspects looked promising: a bellhop, a club owner, a former lover. But each time, the evidence slipped through their fingers. The Black Dahlia became not just a cold case, but a symbol of something darker. The rot beneath the glamour, the price of beauty, the way a city chews people up and spits them out. Then, in the late 1990s, a new name entered the story. Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective, published a book claiming he knew who killed Elizabeth Short, his own father, Dr. George Hodel. George Hodel was a wealthy, brilliant, and deeply disturbed man, a physician who specialized in venereal diseases. He ran in elite circles, knew artists, politicians, and was obsessed with surrealism. He had a mansion in Hollywood that looked like a Mayan temple, the Sowden House, where parties, secrets, and possibly worse took place. Steve claimed that after his father died, he found hidden photos of a woman resembling Elizabeth. He uncovered police surveillance reports from 1950. Yes, the LAPD had actually bugged the Sowden house because George was suspected in the Dahlia case. On one tape, a man, allegedly George, is heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia." They couldn't prove it now, "They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." That tape still exists. Creepy, right? But here's where it gets even darker. In 1949, George Hodel was arrested for molesting his 14-year-old daughter. The trial was sensational. He was ultimately acquitted, but fled the country shortly after, to the Philippines, where, decades later, another woman turned up murdered, cut in half. Steve Hodel's theory is compelling, disturbing, and just plausible enough to feel like it could be true. But there's no physical evidence, no smoking gun, just shadows, whispers, and what feels like the outline of a terrible truth. As word of the gruesome discovery rippled through Los Angeles, investigators scrambled to identify the young woman. There was no purse, no ID, no jewelry, nothing to name her. The only clue they had was the clean and methodical nature of the mutilation. It was a message, deliberate and confident. This wasn't a killing done in rage or panic. It was performance, clinical, cold, and theatrical. Within 24 hours, the LAPD turned to fingerprints. Back then, the FBI had a growing database, and by sheer chance, the victim had been fingerprinted twice before. Once when she applied for a job as a clerk at the Army's Camp Cook, and again when she was arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara. The match came swiftly. Elizabeth Short, age 22. The press got hold of her identity nearly as quickly as the police did. But instead of reporting the facts with compassion or restraint, newspapers began weaving a sensational tapestry around Elizabeth's name. The Los Angeles Examiner dubbed her the Black Dahlia, riffing off a film noir playing in theaters, at the time called the Blue Dahlia. They emphasized her dark hair, her pale skin, her fondness for black clothing. A tragic nickname was born, and from that moment on, Elizabeth Short became a myth as much as a murder victim. But myths can be dangerous, and in Elizabeth's case, they swallowed the truth whole. Journalists flooded Elizabeth's former residences, friends' homes, and even her family's doorstep. One particularly ghoulish reporter from the Examiner allegedly called Elizabeth's mother in Massachusetts, pretending her daughter had won a beauty contest, only to drop the horrifying news moments later after milking her for quotes. It was vile, but it sold papers. As the public's obsession with the Black Dahlia grew, so did the pressure on the LAPD. The investigation from the outside looked enormous. Hundreds of officers were assigned. Dozens of detectives combed through leads, tips, and statements. But the truth? It was chaos. Evidence was contaminated early on. The crime scene had been walked through before it was properly cordoned off. The press hounded witnesses, sometimes before the police had even got to them. And amidst it all, false confessions began pouring in. Over 60 people eventually confessed to the murder of Elizabeth Short. Some walked in off the street. Others wrote letters. A few phoned the police, claiming to be the killer and offering to help if they were given special treatment. Most were dismissed quickly, deemed mentally unstable or seeking attention. But one stood out, not because he seemed particularly believable, but because of what happened after he spoke. 3 days after Elizabeth's body was found, a man called the Los Angeles Examiner. Calmly, he congratulated the paper on the coverage and told the editor he would soon be sending Elizabeth's belongings in the mail. True to his word, a few days later, a manila envelope arrived at the Examiner's office. Inside were Elizabeth's birth certificate, her social security card, some photographs, and a pocket-sized address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed in gold on the cover. The envelope had been carefully wiped clean with gasoline, a crude attempt to erase fingerprints. But one partial print was recovered, too smudged to be useful. The return address? It was made up. The killer, or someone pretending to be him, was taunting the authorities, playing a game, and he was winning. That address book led detectives to a new name, Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub owner in Hollywood who had known Elizabeth. According to those who knew her, she had occasionally stayed at his house, along with other aspiring actresses. Some claimed she rebuffed his advances. Others said they remained cordial. Hansen denied any involvement in her murder, but his connection made him one of the earliest and most publicized suspects. Still, nothing stuck. No one had seen Elizabeth after January 9th, the day she was last confirmed to be alive. That week-long gap between her disappearance and the discovery of her body became a black hole of missing time. Where had she gone? Who had she been with? Why was she killed in such a savage, ritualistic way? One theory suggested that Elizabeth had been picked up by someone she knew and trusted, perhaps someone she believed could help her career. It's possible she was held captive for days, tortured, and then murdered. But why such precision in the dismemberment? Why the surgical nature of her wounds? That's when investigators began looking in a darker direction, toward those with medical knowledge. The detail that Elizabeth's body had been bisected cleanly at the lumbar spine, between the second and third vertebrae, was not common knowledge. It was a textbook procedure known as a hemicorporectomy, something only trained professionals would know how to perform. That narrowed the pool of suspects to doctors, medical students, and anyone with access to surgical tools. It was then that the name Dr. George Hodel began to surface. Dr. Hodel was no ordinary doctor. He was a wealthy, eccentric, and deeply unsettling man who ran a venereal disease clinic in Los Angeles during the 1940s. Brilliant, well-connected, and enigmatic, he hosted lavish, surrealist parties in his private Hollywood estate, which had been designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright. The building looked more like a temple than a home, with labyrinthine halls, high concrete walls, and an atmosphere of quiet dread. Hodel was known to associate with artists, writers, and other cultural elites, but his private life was riddled with scandal and disturbing rumors. In 1949, just 2 years after Elizabeth's death, he was investigated for allegedly molesting his own daughter. Though he was never convicted, the accusations opened a deeper rabbit hole into his psyche. The LAPD actually placed him under surveillance in 1950. They bugged his home, installing microphones in the walls. Over the course of weeks, detectives recorded hundreds of hours of conversations. Some tapes were mundane, others deeply disturbing. And then, chillingly, one statement stood out. At one point, Hodel is heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." That line sent a jolt through investigators, but it wasn't enough. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, his medical knowledge, his violent tendencies, his eerie familiarity with the case, Hodel was never charged. In fact, shortly after the surveillance ended, he left the country altogether. He wouldn't return to the U.S. for decades. Still, some detectives remained convinced. One in particular, Steve Hodel, George's own son, would become obsessed with the idea that his father was the Black Dahlia killer. But that would come much later. Back in 1947, the case began to cool. As weeks turned into months, public interest remained high, but new leads were scarce. The newspapers churned out theory after theory, many of them baseless. Elizabeth's reputation was shredded by the press. She was painted as a temptress, a drifter, someone who invited danger. The truth was far less sensational. She was a young woman chasing a dream, struggling like thousands of the others in post-war America. No concrete evidence ever surfaced. No arrests were made. Elizabeth's family, her mother Phoebe and her sisters, were left with grief confusion, and no justice. The LAPD quietly shelved the case, though they never formally closed it. But the story didn't end there. As the decades rolled on, Elizabeth Short became a cultural icon of tragedy. Books were written, movies were made, artists and musicians invoked her name and image as a symbol of Hollywood's dark side. But underneath the fame, the myth, and the endless speculation, one simple truth remained. Elizabeth Short was real. She lived, she dreamed, and she died a terrifying, lonely death that no one has ever been held accountable for. And in that absence of closure, the myths kept multiplying. In 1999, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, and George Hodel's estranged son, stumbled across a black and white photograph in his father's belongings. The woman in the photo bore an uncanny resemblance to Elizabeth Short. That single image reopened a door Steve had tried to keep shut for most of his life. What followed was a years-long investigation of his own father, using his skills as a detective to comb through evidence, timelines, and records. He pored over the surveillance transcripts from 1950. He interviewed his father's former acquaintances, reviewed autopsy files, and even analyzed George Hodel's handwriting against letters sent by someone claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. And what he found was haunting. Steve claimed that his father not only murdered Elizabeth Short, but may have also been connected to other unsolved murders across Los Angeles. He wrote a book, Black Dahlia Avenger, laying out his case. It became a bestseller and sparked renewed interest in the mystery. But it also divided people sharply. Some hailed him as a brave truth seeker. Others accused him of exploiting his father's legacy and Elizabeth's memory. Still, one detail in Steve's investigation caught the attention of even hardened skeptics: the location of George Hodel's home. His estate, known as the Souden House, was less than 5 miles from where Elizabeth's body had been found. And perhaps more chilling of all, the soil in the back of the property had been tested in the early 2000s. Traces of human decomposition were found. As the years dragged on, the investigation moved from a hunt to a haunting. Witnesses died. Evidence was lost. Suspects disappeared into obscurity. And yet, the face of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, remained frozen in time. Her beauty preserved in grainy black and white photographs, her death looming like a shadow across Los Angeles lore. In 2003, nearly 6 decades after the murder, a retired LAPD detective named Steve Hodel stepped into the spotlight with a shocking claim. He believed he had uncovered the identity of the killer, someone he knew intimately: his own father, Dr. George Hill Hodel. Steve's journey began with an old photograph album he found in his father's belongings after his death. Tucked between images of high society parties and shadowy gatherings, he found 2 photos of a young woman he was convinced was Elizabeth Short. But it wasn't just the photos. George Hodel had always been an enigmatic, arrogant figure. Charismatic, brilliant, but cold and secretive. A respected doctor, fluent in multiple languages, he was well connected in LA's intellectual elite. He even counted surrealist artist Man Ray among his friends. But there was darkness too. In 1949, George Hodel had been tried, though ultimately acquitted, for the sexual abuse of his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar. The trial was messy, disturbing, and revealed shocking allegations about Hodel's private life. Steve began connecting dots that, once isolated, meant little, but together painted a chilling picture. He uncovered that in the 1940s, George Hodel was under surveillance by the LAPD's bugging unit, the result of ongoing suspicions about his activities. The recordings were damning. On one tape, George was heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now." They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. Steve was stunned. Why had this evidence never led to a formal charge? Why had the case just faded? Digging deeper, Steve uncovered more unsettling overlaps. His father had studied in Paris and was obsessed with surrealist art, particularly works involving dismembered or rearranged female forms. Man Ray's influence loomed over George's psyche. The Black Dahlia's mutilated body, with her mouth carved into a Glasgow smile, her limbs placed with intentional symmetry, seemed eerily reminiscent of surrealist motifs. Was it possible that her murder was not just a crime, but a twisted artistic statement? Steve Hodel laid out his findings in a book, Black Dahlia Avenger, and while some hailed it as a long overdue resolution to one of America's darkest unsolved murders, others were more skeptical. Critics questioned the authenticity of the photographs. Some forensic experts said the case against George Hodel was circumstantial at best, and yet the LAPD quietly reopened the file. Inside the department, the word was this: George Hodel had always been on the radar, but without concrete physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness, there was no case to bring, no justice to serve. The trail was too cold. But the fascination didn't fade. In fact, the Black Dahlia case only grew more infamous with time. Movies, novels, documentaries, they all fed the public hunger for answers. Hollywood loved the mystery. Filmmakers adapted it into noir classics and crime thrillers. Authors turned the story into a mythic, tragic archetype of lost beauty and corrupted innocence. And all the while, Elizabeth's real story, the human beneath the headline, was slowly lost in the sensationalism. She wasn't just the Black Dahlia. She was Elizabeth Short, a daughter, a sister, a dreamer, a woman with a fragile heart and hopeful eyes who wanted to find her place in the world, only to be swallowed by it. There's another dimension to this case, one that lingers in the shadows of the official files. In the years since her death, numerous claims of hauntings have sprung up around locations tied to Elizabeth. Some say her ghost walks the halls of the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, the last place she was reportedly seen alive. Hotel staff have told stories of a dark-haired woman in 1940s, attire wandering aimlessly near the lobby, disappearing before they can reach her. In Leimert Park, where her body was discovered, locals have described cold spots and a strange sense of dread near the vacant lot. Some even claim to hear distant screams at night, high, shrill, and unnatural. Is it just urban legend, or is something deeper trying to echo across time? Decades have passed, and still the file remains open, still unsolved, still whispered about in the corridors of true crime history. And yet, for all our obsession with the mystery, who did it, how, and why, we rarely ask a more important question. Why did her story resonate so deeply with us? Why does this particular case continue to captivate, disturb, and unnerve us long after so many others have faded from memory? Perhaps it's because the case sits at the crossroads of everything we fear, and yet can't turn away from. Beauty turned to horror, innocence destroyed, justice denied. Elizabeth Short became more than a victim. She became a symbol, a mirror held up to a city built on illusions. Hollywood in the 1940s was a land of dreams, but those dreams were fragile. Beneath the glamour and flashing lights was a hungry machine, ready to devour the hopeful, the vulnerable, the unprotected. Elizabeth came to Los Angeles chasing something pure, a place in the spotlight, a life less ordinary. But the city had other plans. In her death, she became the very thing she longed to be in life: famous. But not for the reasons she ever imagined. The Black Dahlia was the perfect storm for an enduring mystery. The brutal nature of the crime, the eerie lack of resolution, the suspects ranging from doctors to mobsters to jilted lovers, the police missteps, the media circus, the rumor that her death was tied to something bigger, something darker. Some even suggest Elizabeth may have been part of a secret world, one tangled in the underground clubs and elite social circles of mid-century Los Angeles. There were whispers, always whispers, that she had information she wasn't supposed to have, that she had seen something, heard something, and that someone powerful had silenced her. These are theories, speculative at best, but they feed a chilling thought. What if her murder wasn't the work of a lone madman? What if it was a message? Over the years, more supposed confessions rolled in, some detailed, some deranged. In 1950, a former mortician's assistant claimed he helped transport the body. In the 70s, a man wrote a memoir claiming he had killed her in a drug-induced frenzy. None of these confessions led anywhere. None of them matched the facts, and none brought us closer to the truth. What does it mean when a crime remains unsolved for so long that it stops being a case and becomes a myth? In 2013, new technology was applied to old evidence. Retired detectives worked with digital analysts to examine fingerprints on letters believed to be from the killer. The DNA results were inconclusive, too degraded, too contaminated. After decades of handling, time once again had robbed the investigation of clarity. Still, modern efforts didn't stop. In 2017, a group of independent investigators attempted to retrace Elizabeth's final steps using GPS mapping, digitized city archives, and preserved LAPD documents. They hoped to reconstruct a timeline with enough precision to identify missed patterns. But the gaps were still too large, the trails too faded. Yet something strange emerged in those documents. A list, compiled by detectives in the 1950s, of 25 men who had contact with Elizabeth in the weeks before her murder. Names included bartenders, bellhops, amateur actors, servicemen. Several of them disappeared after 1947. One was found dead in a river in 1952. Another relocated to South America and changed his identity. Were these just coincidences, or threads left dangling? Perhaps the most unsettling thread of all is how her story has been reshaped, not just by the media, but by the public's obsession. Each year, new podcasts, true crime shows, and YouTube documentaries breathe life into the legend, each one adding a twist, a theory, a visual. But who really was Elizabeth Short? She was born in Boston, the third of 5 daughters. Her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression. As a teenager, Elizabeth was diagnosed with bronchitis and underwent surgery that left her with lifelong respiratory problems. Seeking warmth for her lungs, she moved south, first to Florida, then California. She was charming, soft-spoken, and impossibly photogenic. She often wore black, not as a fashion statement, but because it made her feel elegant, classic. The nickname Black Dahlia may have started as a playful reference among friends, inspired by her wardrobe and the film The Blue Dahlia. But after her death, the name stuck and took on a much darker meaning. Friends described her as kind, a little naive, and always chasing something just out of reach. She wasn't a prostitute, despite what the tabloids claimed. She wasn't part of the criminal underworld. She was simply drifting, like many young women in that era, seeking purpose, a break, a better life. And yet, in the blink of an eye, her story was taken from her, her image reduced to a gruesome headline, her voice lost in a storm of speculation. Even in modern archives, her official FBI file is sparse. Pages are redacted, leads are crossed out, names removed. Some theorists believe parts of the case were intentionally buried, locked away to protect reputations, or worse, to hide institutional failure? Was there a cover-up? Or did the weight of too many dead ends simply collapse the case? As of today, the Black Dahlia murder remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. No one has ever been formally charged, no trial, no confession with enough proof to close the file. Just theories, fragments, and a ghost that lingers. And that ghost doesn't rest. Not just in the mind of true crime aficionados or the streets of Los Angeles, but in the culture itself. Every few years, her face reappears in some form. A novel, a movie, a TV series. Her tragedy is reinvented, stylized, dramatized, but rarely humanized. In 2006, Brian De Palma's film The Black Dahlia introduced her story to a new generation, but with heavy fiction. Earlier, James Ellroy's noir novel, by the same name, had done something similar, turning the real tragedy into a backdrop for complex, fictionalized crime. These adaptations captured attention, but often missed the real heartbeat of the story. A young woman whose life was lost, and whose identity was buried under the weight of myth. We romanticize the unsolved because they let us play detective. We follow the trails, study the photos, and compare handwriting. We watch documentaries and podcasts that promise new evidence. But often we're just going in circles, around a center that remains disturbingly hollow. And yet, some cannot stop chasing the truth. Steve Hodel, the retired LAPD homicide detective who believes his father was the killer, has spent over 2 decades piecing together timelines, photos, even secret audio recordings. His critics say he's grasping at straws, interpreting evidence to fit a personal theory. But Hodel pushes forward, writing book after book, convinced that the answers are hidden in plain sight. Then there are the archivists, historians who sift through microfilm, digitize police reports, and build online databases dedicated to Elizabeth's life. For them, it's not about sensationalism, it's about clarity, about restoring a name that was lost in headlines. And there are artists, painters, photographers, even tattooists, all drawn to Elizabeth's face, striking, tragic, enigmatic. She becomes muse and martyr in equal measure. The mystery of her death somehow fuels creation in others. It's a strange form of immortality, one she never asked for. But what would justice look like this many years later? A name, a confession, a government file finally unsealed? Or would justice be something quieter, like remembering her without the blood, without the myth? Just Elizabeth, a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. Because behind every murder mystery, there is a person, a human being whose story was interrupted. Elizabeth's story didn't end in that vacant lot in Leimert Park. It kept going, through newspaper ink, through whispered conversations, through every detective who thought they had the answer, and everyone who walked away, defeated. Her story continues through us, through the fact that we still care, that we're still asking. And maybe, in some small way, that's its own kind of justice. Because for all the darkness around her death, there's also something strangely unbroken about the way her name has endured. It never vanished. It was never forgotten. And perhaps that, in a world so quick to move on, is its own kind of legacy. What strikes me most about the Black Dahlia case is not just the brutality of the crime. It's the silence that followed, the dead ends, the missing files, the leads that dried up before they could be tested. It's as if someone, or something, wanted this story to remain in the shadows, untouchable, a permanent scar in the city's memory. I think about the weight of all those unanswered questions, the detectives who carried them to their graves, the journalists who spent their entire careers circling a black hole. the families that were changed forever by a single headline. And then I think about Elizabeth herself. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a body in a field. She was a young woman who moved across the country chasing something brighter than the life she'd been given. She laughed. She wrote letters. She struck poses for the camera with big dreams in her eyes. She was, in so many ways, just like anyone else, trying to find their place in a world that didn't always make space. That world failed her. And perhaps it continues to fail her every time her name is used as a punchline, or fictional trope, or just another unsolved mystery in a top 10 list. It's easy to get caught up in the darkness of this story. The grotesque details, the chilling crime scene, the mystery. But I think the real power of the Black Dahlia case is in what it reveals about us, about the things we're drawn to, the things we fear, and the way we respond when a human being becomes an icon of horror. We may never know who killed Elizabeth Short, but we can choose to remember her with humanity, not just as a question mark, but as a person, not just as a legend, but as a life. And in doing that, maybe we reclaim something. Maybe we bring just a little light into a story that's lived in shadows for far too long. Thanks for staying with me through this long, dark journey. If stories like this intrigue you, ones that peel back the layers of history's unsolved, the eerie and the unexplained, then you're already in the right place. There are more mysteries waiting on Night Story HQ, more voices lost in time, more strange truths that deserve a second look. So if you haven't already, subscribe, check out the other stories, and leave a comment telling me what you think happened to Elizabeth Short. Maybe one day, enough pieces will fall into place. Until then, we remember, stay curious, stay safe, and as always, thanks for listening.